One of our most popular guests that we've ever had on the show is Richard Duncan. He was a guest on episode 69, Macroeconomic Outlook from a Former IMF Consultant, and episode 121, The End of Quantitative Tightening and the Future of Monetary Policy. Richard has not only been popular, he's one of my favorite guests as well because his understanding of the global capital markets is up there with the best of the best. He tracks this stuff very, very closely. However, Richard and I do not see eye to eye on every single topic, especially as it relates to monetary policy, because he is an advocate of significant government spending in order to spur on economic growth. In episode 121, he voiced that he's an advocate of what he refers to and what Ray Dalio refers to as MP3, which we'll get into a little bit in this discussion, essentially government spending to spur economic output. But here's the thing. If we were to use jujitsu belt levels, I would consider myself to be kind of a blue belt when it comes to debating economic topics. Now, I have the potential to be a purple belt very quickly because I know who to call, I know what resources to use, I know what questions to ask, but I don't spend my time preparing for economic debates because I'm a real estate investor, not an economist. So what's my point? Richard Duncan is definitely a black belt in terms of his knowledge. So rather than try to debate him on the show, I wanted to call a friend who has spoken many times at the Soho Forum and the Mises Institute to address some of the questions that Richard Duncan brought up and also discuss kind of the different worldview when it comes to economics. It's a really, really important topic, especially given where it looks like we might be headed politically. So in this discussion, we're going to discuss, number one, we're going to start with what were the causes of the Great Recession. It's really important. What can we learn about the Great Recession in terms of the future as well? Should we look to Japan as a template for economic monetary policy? Now, of course, Richard Duncan has his problems with the way that Japan has handled things, but generally speaking, it's an important conversation to have given their debt to GDP ratio. Here's another question. Is China's government and their investment strategy that the government has used in technology specifically a model that the US should start to consider and even implement more so? And of course, what does our guest think about Ray Dalio's MP3? We're going to talk about it all today. The people that love economics, which I know a lot of you do, I think you're going to find this pretty interesting. Also, if you are not yet on the Cashflow Connections mailing list, you better get on it. Last week, I recorded something that I'm really proud of, which is going to be exclusively available for the people who purchased my book, Raising Capital for Real Estate, prior to it being launched. The video is called Closing Strategies for High Net Worth Investors, and there are so many takeaways in there. If you're raising your money right now, you are definitely going to be grateful if you do this pre-sale. So go to cashflowconnections.com, sign up for the mailing list. You'll get an email once this pre-sale is available. And pay attention, we're not sending this out to all of our mailing list. It's only going out to the people that are on the Cashflow Connections mailing list. So go to cashflowconnections.com, sign up, and when the pre-sale is available, you will get instant access to Closing Strategies for High Net Worth Investors. All right, I hope you enjoyed the episode. How's it going, everyone? Our guest for today is Gene Epstein, who recently stepped down from a 26-year stint as the economics and books editor of Barron's with plans to write long-form articles and books. He last published a book which was Econospinning, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulate the Numbers. He's taught economics at the City University of New York and St. John's University and has worked as a senior economist for the New York Stock Exchange. He is also the executive director and moderator of the Soho Forum, which is where he hosts debates on a variety of important topics. It is so cool. It is the coolest platform ever. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure to do so right after this interview. And he also is an occasional debater himself, which is really fascinating. So, Gene, thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be with you, Hunter.
So a lot of my listeners will likely be familiar with some of your work. I mean, it's one of the most incredible backgrounds. I mean, some people call you the godfather of libertarianism, and for good reason.
Gosh,
I mean,
no.
you've got definitely some of the most incredible connections and history within the libertarian movement. But for people that aren't as familiar with your background, let us know just a little bit about it. And also, I'd like it kind of to segue into how you got introduced into the Austrian school.
Yeah. Well, my story is actually very specific in this sense. I was raised in socialism. My mother was literally a member of the Communist Party. And so I was a red diaper baby and, very much a supporter of Stalin and Lenin when I was 7 years old, and then drifted away from my mother's loyalty to Bolshevism and became a democratic socialist in my teens and early 20s. I studied economics at the New School for Social Research, which is very socialist, very left-wing. And I was teaching economics, as you mentioned, City University, St. John's, and working on my PhD, but getting increasingly dispirited about all of it, about the mainstream economics and about anything that I could discover from left-wing economics as well. And I just purely by chance picked up a copy of Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, and picked up a couple of times browsing in the New School library. And only, I think after the third or fourth time, I began to read it, all 2 volumes. And that was my way in. Because I'd been teaching mainstream economics and was so familiar with left-wing economics, that book especially spoke to me. Perhaps some of your listeners have read it. One of its values for me at the time was that it had a number of digressions about mainstream economics and how it got things wrong. It wasn't just, this is the right way to think about economics, but here is why the mainstream approach is wrong. And so once I finished those 2 volumes, I then just tore through all I'd find on Austrian economics. At the time, living in New York City, I could bike down from the Upper West Side to the Laissez-Faire bookshop on Mercer Street downtown, which was operating at the time, a bricks and mortar bookshop that had just about everything published by the Austrians or free market people. And once a week, I would buy a couple of books, browse for an hour or so, buy a couple of books and take them home. So over the next few years, I schooled myself in Austrian economics. That's how I intellectually developed in that way. I was not enamored of college teaching in any case. I dropped out, and so I drifted in my career, but I was a kind of a closet Austrian. And then purely by chance, I got a job at Barron's, initially, as a matter of fact, to write about the commodities markets, because I'd worked in that field as an analyst. And then because I was writing interesting stuff about economics, they made me an economics columnist. I had a column called Economic Beat and then became book review editor as well. But so from that perch, I was an Austrian, although, of course, the difficulties of writing as an Austrian in the practical day-to-day world when you're writing 1,000-word columns is that it's difficult sometimes to apply Austrian economics to practical data. Sometimes you're making assumptions. Sometimes your readers don't even quite know you're an Austrian. But I enjoyed my job. And as book review editor, I was able to bring in a lot of fellow Austrians from Mises Institute and elsewhere to review books. And so it was a good ride. And it seemed to suit me well. I spoke at the Mises Institute a number of times. And again, I wrote a book called Econospinning. And now I'm happily running a nonprofit called, again, as you mentioned, the Soho Forum, where I've debated 4 times. And at the Soho Forum, I'm debating again in a month. And I just want to make that announcement to those of you who might be able to make it to New York City on November 5th. But I guess that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I guess I could elaborate if you have any questions about my background specifically.
You know, I want to get to kind of the general discussion that we're going to talk about today. But before we do, I want to hear, what is the debate topic that you're talking about in a month?
Well, I've taken on socialism precisely because my background is in socialism, because Mommy was a commie. Mm-hmm. I am debating now for the second time a prominent socialist. And in this case, it's Richard Wolff, who has been called, the most prominent Marxist economist in the country, emeritus professor from University of Massachusetts. And he knew a number of very much the same people that I knew when I studied at the New School. And he's a bottom-up socialist, one of those socialists who completely repudiates all the socialisms that have ever existed in the various nation states. He calls them state capitalist. And so he's operating on a clean slate. His socialism is never existed before. I know those people. I can deal with those people. And so I wanted to debate him especially. A year and a half ago, I debated Bhaskar Sankara, a young guy who was also a democratic socialist. This is a new breed. so to speak, a new breed. I'm exaggerating when I say that. The democratic socialist impulse really goes back to the New Left of the 1960s, and it's really kind of old. It's 40 years old, but it's being pushed. And when you try to approach these people by pointing out that things haven't worked out so well in Venezuela or in Cuba or in China under Mao Zedong, they say, oh, well, of course not. We've got a democratic socialist solution for you. And I have to make the subtle argument, and I think not many people can, that the kind of socialism that they, with well intentions, are trying to bring about will only lead to the old despotism. But I also make the point, by the way, a point that's hardly new with me, that we can have worker-owned companies within capitalism. It's not too difficult to bring about. So that's what the argument I'm going to make will be in a nutshell. And so because socialism has made such a comeback, we're going to rent a very large hall and try to invite all the young socialists in New York to come to listen to me debate Richard Wolff.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the beauty of capitalism, right? If you want to have a socialist paradise within capitalism and it's the best way to structure society, well, then guess what? It gets to be the way that society is structured because capitalism is all about kind of the freedom of letting people make those choices. Exactly. So I want to kind of segue into the discussion around the business cycle theory. We recently had a guest on the show, Richard Duncan, who I have a lot of respect for. He's incredibly knowledgeable and he's the author of a lot of books, one of which, I was very, very influenced by, which is The Dollar Crisis. From the conversations we had, it sounded like Richard has somewhat, in some ways, changed some of his positions he was an advocate of back then because of the aftermath and lead up to the Great Recession and kind of what we've learned since then. Now, his takeaways are very different than my takeaways, but before we can jump into his and mine and yours, I'd like to get you an opportunity to talk about why you believe the Great Recession was so pronounced in terms of the collapse and also why the aftermath was so significant and different than some of the other corrections of the past.
Well, I have to, unfortunately, partly duck that question. Maybe I can be helpful by approaching it from my own perspective. I do believe that the one thing that the Austrians can teach us is what causes economic downturn. Now, the cause of the Great Recession was clearly an Austrian drama, and I will briefly elaborate on that in a moment. But then when we look back on the downturns that are conventionally measured, and I think that they have it more or less right. They try to, count angels on the head of a pin. I'm talking about the business cycle dating committee that dates peaks and troughs.
Yes.
When we look back on them, we find, for example, that the recession of 74, 75 was pretty severe. The recession of 81, 82 was even worse. And then there were two mild recessions in 1991 and in 2001. And then the Great Recession, the worst downturn since the Great Depression. Now, looking back on why two bad recessions, two pretty deep recessions, were followed by two mild recessions, difficult to completely explain that. Reasonable people can disagree about why they occurred. Obviously, they all brought tragedy and human anguish. They were all unnecessary in a market economy. But as for why that pattern prevailed, I think that we can't be absolutely sure. But I can, of course, mention some things, but I'm not going to be able to give the decisive story. What I would want to say, however, is that the Great Recession, which has been the main focus of attention, obviously, over the last decade, was clearly a case in which government brought about an interest rate that was too low for the market. I can begin with an anecdote, which I think is really telling, that when Angelo Mozilla, who was head of countrywide finance, was receiving an award at Harvard, some kind of real estate think tank at Harvard, was giving him an award in the year 2003. And he was being applauded by these Harvard types. And he was selling mortgages to those government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And he said in his remarks how wonderful it was that his organization Countrywide was giving mortgages, providing mortgages to low-income people because 80% of them were able to pay on those mortgages. And isn't that wonderful? Amazingly, anybody who'd studied just the simple math of mortgage interest rates and risk in that case could have told him that if you are saying you have a 20% delinquency and default rate, then those mortgages are being mispriced. The interest rate you're charging, that is being charged on those mortgages, is not sufficient to cover the risks, to cover the 20% defaults that you are suffering, because presumably these people knew that standard mortgages, conventional mortgages in normal times have a 1% default delinquency rate, 2%. This was 20%. So why do I tell that story? That was clearly a case in which, because of government intervention through government-sponsored enterprises, and indeed through the Federal Reserve underwriting it all, interest rates were being maintained too low. And complementing that as well, of course, is that down payments were too low. Character, credit, and collateral were simply being distorted by government intervention. And so that's a classic Austrian narrative. And we can talk about how the government got into it in the early 90s, initiated by George H.W. Bush, pushed very hard by Bill Clinton because he wanted to goose up home ownership. That was his big mantra. We can talk about how George W. Bush picked up on the policy, how HUD, the Housing, Urban and Development Corporation of the federal government, was mandating that Fannie and Freddie continue to buy mortgages. Fannie and Freddie were a government-sponsored enterprise, which is a classical crony capitalist organization. These companies were traded on the New York Stock Exchange, but their debt was implicitly guaranteed by the federal government. And so they acted as central banks in sense, buying up mortgages. That was their role, to buy mortgages. Technically, they didn't originate mortgages, but they were buying up mortgages, and they were mandated to continue to buy mortgages that were being issued to people with below median incomes. And then once that began to happen, then in order to get people to qualify for those mortgages, they had to keep lowering the down payment requirements. And then once people are buying houses with 3% down payments, those 3% down payments are essentially a small amount of collateral and margin bidding up house prices. And then you find from actual official data, house prices in various regions of the country, like the West Coast, like New England, are climbing by 10, 12, and 13% by the late 90s and the year 2000. All of this begins to happen, and then a few years later, the private sector gets involved with these high-risk mortgages, because the private sector crony capitalists see the potential to get into mortgages where houses are being purchased that increase in value by 10 and 15%, which offers you an incredible amount of protection, because if the mortgage is default, then you have an asset that's risen by 10 to 15%, or you can refinance. And so the mania then is induced by Fannie and Freddie, and then by the Federal Reserve, that sets the interest rate below the market. Certainly the best research shows that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, clearly pushed the short-term interest rate below what the market would have made it. That's a subtle statement. There's an interest rate that the market would determine, and that's kind of something we always have to guess at. But one good estimate shows that they pushed the interest rate below the normal market rate by the year 2000 to underwrite all of this effort by the federal government to create a housing bubble. So that's a classic Austrian story.
Right.
It was hidden. The title of a very good book about it is called Hidden in Plain Sight. It all happened in plain sight. And so I don't know whether the gentleman you just mentioned has repudiated the Austrian story about what caused the Great Recession. Is that one of his problems?
No, it's not exactly that. But before we even transition to that, it's really interesting to hear. First of all, I just remember when we were first introduced at Freedom Fest, it was to comment on the recent movie, The Bubble Movie, which is actually about exactly this. And we did have your good friend and colleague, Tom Woods, on the show recently to discuss a similar topic. So I think that paints a very clear picture as far as the run-up. I think, transitioning into kind of the aftermath, that's where I think the Austrian school and help guide me through this. But
sure.
One of the things that is really interesting is that with all the inflation that took place, because we all know what happened, right? That massive bubble was built up. The bottom was eventually pulled out. From your perspective and my perspective, it's very clear that not only, hidden in plain sight is the perfect way to put it, because prior to the collapse, politicians were championing the fact that people were getting mortgages they would no otherwise be able to get, like specifically saying, look how good we are. We've been able to create this situation. And then the massive, exactly. The aftermath takes place. And then we enter a relatively new paradigm, which is quantitative easing. And this quantitative easing is extremely, extremely significant. Yeah. The thing that I think Richard Duncan was surprised to see, at least from the Austrian school, is that massive inflation that took place. We didn't really, from his perspective at least, we didn't have a massive depression, the likes of which many people believe we would have had without quantitative easing. And we didn't have a dollar collapse, and we didn't have massive inflation, at least compared to the CPI.
Yes.
What is kind of your response to those challenges with, the quantitative easing?
Yes. Okay. I hear you. Let me see if I'm probably going to do a somewhat inadequate response. I mean, with respect to the price inflation issue, certainly I know, for example, that my esteemed colleague and friend Bob Murphy thought that there would be price inflation. At the time, by the way, I could mention I was wrong about a number of things, so I'm not trying to put myself above Bob Murphy especially. But in this case, I've long seen one special disinflationary force in the world that I think is only in mid-course and is yet to fully play out. I think it's got another 10 to 15 years. It's basically the globalization of the world economy that started slowly in the early 90s and continued slowly. The fact that so much supply can tap the services of low-paid labor,
right,
of 50 cent an hour labor. The supply side of price inflation is often ignored. I applaud Milton Friedman, who was not really an Austrian, but Milton Friedman's comment at the time he made it, that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. He was only trying to teach people that insight, which of course is valid, at a time when it was just little understood. So indeed, obviously, it is a monetary phenomenon always, but he might have added, probably if he was alive today, that monetary expansion is necessary, although not sufficient to price inflation. If you have a considerable amount of disinflationary force on the supply side, then you might not get a whole lot of price inflation. And then on top of that, another reason why I didn't go along with Bob's prediction that there would be a lot of price inflation is that we were starting from a fair amount of slack resources on the supply side in the domestic U.S. economy itself. And so that's the other reason. Now, that slack, as you know, of course, has mostly been tightened. The slack in the domestic economy, has mostly been tightened, but I still see disinflationary forces from the rest of the world. With the U.S. multinationals and other companies from the advanced industrial world are still employing a relatively small percentage of all the low-paid workers who could service us. I believe that, of course, if we didn't have monetary expansion, then we would have falling prices. The goods part of the personal consumption expenditure deflator has been pretty flat. There's been no inflation to speak of over the last 20 years as conventionally measured. And I think, again, that's indicative of the fact that so much is coming in from abroad. On top of that, of course, we've had, in terms of disinflationary forces, we have had an unleashing of price competition domestically. We have had the Walmart effect, having the Amazon effect. There is a fierce amount of price competition in the U.S. marketplace that was far less prevalent than it is today. So all of those forces, I think, are serving to mute inflation, price inflation, And of course, if we didn't have various government constraints, if we didn't have monetary expansion, we would have a 3% fall every year in the price indexes, not anything like a 1.5% to 2% rise. So I don't think that in itself is too surprising. Again, not surprising if you recognize that price inflation is not just a monetary phenomenon. It has to get the supply side to actively participate in it. And I could apply the same insight to what happened in the 1960s and 1970s when we did have legitimate double-digit inflation. That started from a very tight labor market in the U.S. It started from a point at which we really did not have the end of the Cold War. We did not have anything much in the way of disinflationary forces in the global economy, and that's why we got 10% inflation. Now, I think that it could come again. We could get it again. Certainly, Alan Greenspan, somebody who I have virtually no respect for, at least did make an insightful point in one of his books, in which he said that by the late 2020s or early 2030s, we could have a real powerful return of price inflation because we're going to have the combination of the fact that probably most of the disinflationary forces in the global economy will be played out. And then we're going to have, at the same time, huge amount of pressure for the U.S. economy to print its way out of insupportable debt. And so at that point, he pointed out, the head of whoever is the central bank at the time in the late 20s and early 30s is going to have a huge amount of pressure put on him to print money and to bring about the dangers of 10% double-digit price inflation.
Right.
So that's what I'd have to say about price inflation. You mentioned some other points. The other point of having to do with the dollar collapsing, I would regard the answer to that one as fairly simple, compared to what? Certainly the dollar collapsed in relation to Bitcoin, certainly.
Right.
Getting into what happened to gold, that's a different story, an interesting one. But the point is that compared to the rest of the world, compared to the yen, compared to the euro, again, you're talking about a lot of sick economies. And so maybe those other economies against which we're measuring the dollar, the euro, the British pound, the yen, maybe those economies were a bit sicker than ours. Because when we explore, we find, there's a fair amount of good evidence to indicate that they were and are a bit sicker than the U.S. economy. And so the dollar, compared to the currencies of those sick economies, did not collapse. What's so surprising about that?
Okay, that's actually a good segue, because this is something that is somewhat challenging, particularly as it relates to Europe or Japan, without looking into the details of the numbers. So just to put some numbers on it. So the European Central Bank owns about 25% of their government debt. The Bank of Japan owns about 40% of the government debt. And we haven't seen this runaway inflation. This is a topic that has kind of fascinated me, particularly as it relates to Japan. And the reason this is interesting is that Japan, as you know, experienced basically an 80% asset price correction across a variety of asset classes, real estate, the stock market, et cetera. They didn't consider what we would consider to be experience something similar to a Great Depression, despite the fact that this massive asset price correction took place. There was never double-digit unemployment, at least not the way that we would measure it. They also have about a almost 250% debt to GDP ratio. So what I'm getting at here is that the yen, it does not have the advantages that the United States has, but we still haven't seen Japan experience these things that we would expect to experience if we viewed this world through the lens of sound money, at least not going through the level of detail that I think is required to have this conversation. So what I'm getting at here is if Japan was able to have a debt to GDP ratio that's very, very high, why shouldn't the United States have a similar debt to GDP ratio? And knowing that we likely will achieve a very high debt to GDP ratio, why shouldn't we, as in the United States government, invest in technologies which could solidify it as a global leader for the next 100 years, as opposed to things like spending money on wars or wasting money on things like that? I mean, if we know that's where it's headed and Japan hasn't suffered the challenges that we would anticipate, why haven't we just figured out this new tool of making cool inventions?
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Anything, I will have to say, of course, in the tail end of your question, anything but spending money on wars is probably pretty good.
Agreed.
Because, obviously, spending money on wars, kills a lot of people and wastes a lot of resources and probably makes the world a worse place to live in. And it certainly does make the world the worst place to live in our foreign policy does far more harm than good. And so I would want a complete rollback, but that's just a political statement. The other part of your question, I guess it's two parts. Yeah, you, of course, helpfully wrote me a list of some of your questions, some of the issues that interest you. And I looked up some numbers about Japan. One of them, by the way, has to do with the official measure of the debt. Now, interestingly, in my case, I've been taking a deep dive into the U.S. numbers for over a quarter, for 30 years. Before I joined Barron's, I was a senior economist at the New York Stock Exchange. And so I'm very familiar with those numbers. And I know, and that's of course why I wrote a book called Econospinning. And I know that there's a lot of problems with interpreting them properly, with measuring them properly. I'm actually working on a long-form essay. A book I'm working on has to do with measuring how well the average person has done, the average household has done in the U.S. economy. And you really have to know how those numbers are compiled in order to navigate that, because even academic economists who are supposed to know what they're talking about misinterpret the numbers all the time. So I mention that only because I'm cautious about talking about Japan's numbers, because I'm not nearly as familiar with Japan's numbers as I am of the U.S. data, and I know how difficult it is to interpret U.S. data. However, with that said, I read, for example, that the official statement about the 250% is very misleading, and that it's similar to a number cited for the U.S., and that so much of that debt is actually intergovernmental debt. And intergovernmental debt is possibly a proxy for unfunded liabilities of the future. But if we're talking about the actual debt burden of the Japanese economy, similar to the way the Congressional Budget Office measures our debt burden, the U.S. debt burden, at about a little under 80%, meaning debt owed to the public. Not the debt, not the Social Security Trust Fund, not this debt where this government agency A owes money to government agency B. I could get into that, but that's bogus debt. It's going to be ultimately paid in the future, whether it's on the books or not. I don't know if I've explained that properly, but the Social Security Trust Fund, for example, the so-called Social Security Trust Fund, doesn't exist. I did a debate at the Soho Forum with a professor from the New School who actually thinks that the trust fund exists and that it can't weigh on the federal deficit. I mention all that only because I'm trying to establish my bona fides in trying to explain to you that Japan apparently, based upon the measurement that I read, has a debt to GDP ratio of 134% of the GDP most recently, and that the rest is potentially the future unfunded liabilities, but not real debt. The 134% is what the Japanese government owes to others. Debt held by the public, or debt that could be held by a central bank, yes, that could collect on that debt. So I only mention that because the numbers are like 250% sound so ridiculous. 134% is quite high, quite disturbing. I grant you that, but I only wanted to bring us down to earth about that. With that said, let's cut to the chase a little bit more. If you actually look at the growth of the U.S. economy versus the growth of the Japanese economy over the last 11 years, 18 years, then you're including, in the U.S. case, the catastrophic Great Recession. I would include the, of course, less catastrophic 2001 recession. And both of those incidents, of course, obviously subtracted greatly from economic growth of the U.S. So, okay, Japan did not have those downturns. So therefore, when you're measuring the U.S. economy over the 18 years or over the 11 years of the past, you're including those horrific downturns. And for Japan, you're not including them. Japan had a steady as it went kind of growth. And I guess you would have to agree that it's better to have something steady and don't have 10% unemployment. I guess you'd grant that. However, the U.S. economy has grown at about twice the rate, or by some measures triple the rate, I could quote the numbers, as the Japanese economy has. Had the U.S. economy been performing over the last 11 years, 18 years, the way the Japanese economy has been performing, we would really have a scandal on our hands. I could read the numbers, but I don't know if your listeners are going to retain them. Now, the other part of it that I did do was that when I mentioned that to people, they say, oh, well, Japan has a declining population and the U.S. has an increasing population. Well, when we talk about population and using population to adjust for economic growth, it's really better and more precise to talk about the size of the labor force. It turns out that Japan's declining population has a lot to do with the fact that they're not having a lot of children. We're having a lot of children because we've got a lot of immigrants who have large families. Then, of course, there are the Hasidic Jews who have large families. So that sort of like gives you a lot of data noise. What I did was I looked at the Japanese labor force, which I found has actually been about flat over the last 11 years. It declined by about 1.5% over the last 18 years, while the U.S. labor force has increased. But even adjusting then to the fact that the U.S. economy has had an increasing labor force and the Japanese economy has had a mildly decreasing labor force, even when you make that adjustment, Japan's economic performance has been abysmal compared to the U.S., at half as good. We've been doing twice as good. That includes then the Great Recession. It includes factors in the advantage that we have an increasing labor force and they have a slightly declining labor force. So if that's the model we want to use, then it's pretty pathetic. If some people are going to say, well, why not just be like the Japanese? I would say anybody in his right mind would say, no, thank you to that. That's not what any economy should or could want to aspire toward. So I would think that that's sort of the end of the argument. Now, we can also talk as well about the special nature of the Japanese debt. As perhaps you know as well, 90% of it is owned domestically. In our case, it's about a little over 60% is owned domestically. We have a lot of foreigners who own our debt, much more than Japan's. We have Japanese people who apparently are willing to lend money to their government for basically zero interest rates. Americans don't do that. Foreigners don't do that with the U.S. So they have a different the cards that are dealt them are a bit different from the cards that are dealt us. I personally believe, of course, that it's rather disturbing for a government to be borrowing at zero or even negative interest rates, because that is very seductive and could lead to disaster in the future. However, that's an advantage the Japanese economy has now. It's not an advantage the U.S. economy is likely to have.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, there's obviously so many ways that we can take this conversation, but the last point I think is really critical. So I think that part of Richard's argument, and potentially Ray Dalio's, who we'll talk about in a moment, is that the government has the ability to borrow this money at incredibly low interest rates. I think the model of Japan is an example of the fact that even without the advantages that the U.S. has, Japan has not suffered those massive problems. But I think part of this argument is that Japan did it incorrectly because they did it not in an investment in the right things, in the sense that if they had made investments in robotics or green energy or neurosciences or nanotechnology, et cetera, that perhaps this would have spurred massive GDP growth, et cetera, as opposed to wasting it on other things. And we can talk about Ray Dalio in a second, but I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, that was the other part of what you asked. I mean, look, I guess this is a long story, and in a way, really it should be reduced to a single sentence. So anybody who believes that you want to give any government money to make capital investment in the future, anybody who believes that should read a little bit about what happened to the former Soviet Union or what happened to Mao Zedong's China. Anybody who can, at this stage in history, in 2019, who can actually propose that we give the government a lot of money with which to make investments in the future should read a little bit about MITI, the planning agency that ran Japan. It was corrupt. It was crony capitalist. It discouraged companies that were going to start building automobiles. It made all the wrong investments. Anybody who thinks that we can trust government bureaucrats who have no skin in the game with investing in the future, again, does not belong in the dialogue. Excuse me for being so harsh. But, oh my God, that kind of statement can make anybody with his head screwed on right a little bit impatient. We cannot trust the government to make investments in the future. They're only going to waste it. It's like giving a gun to a baby. It's stupid.
It's interesting that you say that because I have a quote from Ray Dalio that I wanted to read, and I don't even know if I need much comment on that based on what you just said, but I actually thought it was dead on, which is that as long as countries have their debts denominated in their own currencies, these policies would likely work to smooth out economic downturns, and the only things that stand in their way are the limited capabilities of economic policymakers and the limited political abilities to, quote, do the right thing. And actually, I agree 100%, meaning that it's impossible for them to do the right thing, no matter how hard they try. So I think he's dead on there.
Okay, right. I don't know. Look, Ray Dalio is a piece of work in his own right. By the way, I mean, I'm one of those who happens to know a couple of people who actually worked for Ray Dalio, and I gather that his firm is some kind of, functioning insane asylum. I don't know if you know some of the rules he has. He himself, the last person I'd want to run society would be Ray Dalio. One of his rules is that nobody can ever have a confidential conversation at his company. This is a little tale I want to tell about that. If you ever talk about anything with anybody, it's got to be broadcast. There has to be complete transparency in the organization. There can't be any side conversations between people. Now, obviously, this can never really be practiced. But if people even try to do that, then they'll have to recognize you can't run a company that way. People have to have confidences. They have to have networks. There are things that cannot be divulged to everybody. I mean, let's not belabor that any further. But anyway, sure. You're basically saying that Ray Dalio apparently has said, provided that we have philosopher kings running the economy, then we can trust them with making investments in the future. But so he's a little bit concerned about whether we ever will get philosopher kings. Is that the import of that quote?
Somewhat. I mean, I think the key there, I think that at least the part that Richard Duncan is sympathetic to is the fact that as long as countries have debt instruments denominated in their own currencies, it is a tool by which you can use investment. And then another part of this, I want to transition to this because this is something that I think is more on the Ray Dalio part of things, but is becoming more and more popular in today's political environment, which is, what most people refer to as helicopter money. If there is a challenge that's taking place, particularly if there is a significant recession, we have tried the lowering of interest rates. We have also tried quantitative easing in terms of injection of capital, but what we have not tried is injection of capital to consumers, people that are going to spend the money. This is what some people are referring to as MP3, and I believe that Ray Dalio coined this phrase. What are your thoughts on MP3? It's modern monetary policy, basically, but people get to receive the money directly as opposed to through banks or whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, again, I'm a little bit aghast. George W. Bush did that. I mean, send a check to every consumer. We can unravel how foolish that is, how little it works. You send a check to, is that what you're basically saying, is send a check to every consumer?
Yes, some form of, like people say, like helicopter money or universal basic income.
Well, it goes to every consumer. And again, I guess maybe let me back up and say that I guess these intellectually rudderless people apparently don't understand. If they did understand the causes of a business cycle, they might be able to have a clue about how we get out of it. It's a misallocation of resources. And when resources are misallocated, you have to let the market correct. We, to some degree, did have that. I looked up the numbers recently. We now have many fewer workers, proportionate especially, but even absolutely, working in residential construction. We have to reorient the economy, allow the economy to reorient so that there is not this sort of malinvestment. That's what has to be done. I guess because these people are so clueless, they desperately think that one government remedy or another might do the trick. And again, let me just return to one of the points. I mean, the helicopter money, and if we have, and as well as if we have debt denominated in our own currency, we should allow the government to invest. Again, I would ask these people, can you cite a single example in which massive government investment in the future ever worked out? We have many examples of it. It was in the 1980s that a lot of lunatics were infatuated with the Japanese economy, with its very rapid growth at the time, partly much of it based on a bubble. Some of it, of course, based on the fact the Japanese economy was basically adopting technology that had already been developed by others.
Yes.
And they were celebrating MITI, the planning agency. I could recommend a couple of very good studies of MITI. It was a disaster. There was no vision. There cannot be. Have them read Hyatt. Have them read Bill Easterly.
All right. Well, I think we've made this point clear, but I just wanted to, in all fairness, mention that China came up repeatedly. Example of potentially putting themselves in a position to, they have taken advantage of this situation that they have. Their economy has grown drastically, and they may be investing in technologies at a rate much greater than us. Yeah. Us, quote, the U.S.
Well, maybe it should occur that there was massive market liberalization in China starting in 1978. There was a turn toward markets, turn toward the decentralized use of markets. Part of it motivated by the restiveness and rebellion of the farmers. There was this statement made by the government to be rich is glorious. They encouraged free market capitalism. All of the indexes, the Economic Freedom Index, for example, of the Fraser Institute, Cato Institute, shows a massive movement toward capitalism and toward markets that started in the late 1970s. Maybe it should occur to this person that had a great deal to do with the success of the Chinese economy, and that the government's involvement diminished. And that's when the average Chinese began to climb his way out of poverty. Maybe that should occur to him. And then try to analyze, try to ask, when you have government bureaucrats who have no skin in the game, when you have the centralization of control, when you don't let 100 flowers bloom, when you don't understand the Hayekian insight about the dispersion of knowledge, that you're doomed to stagnation. But that's the wrong way in which to march. We had infatuation with the Japanese economy in the 1980s because they were supposed to be the planned economy. Hopefully we got over that. And now we have this foolish infatuation with the Chinese economy, the degree to which the central government is in control, and we don't realize that the degree to which China has succeeded has a great deal to do with the revolution, the capitalist revolution that started in China in the late 1970s.
All right. Well, we've definitely discussed this topic significantly. I also wanted to open up to hear if there's anything else you wanted to add to this, Josh, that you think we have left out. There's obviously many, many ways. Like I mentioned, I don't think that maybe we could set up a debate at the Soho Forum because I think it would be interesting. I don't think it's as unpopular as we would like to believe. But anyway, is there anything else that you want?
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. The viewpoint, that the Chinese, the same fallacy about the Japanese having everything figured out. I mean, you probably know that. I mean, one would think that we learned our lesson from that. But you mean the Ray Dalios and these other people who think that we need more government investment, that to appoint these philosopher kings in charge of government to invest? Of course, no, indeed. Obviously, worse is happening. Obviously, you have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, obviously, trying to take the White House, who could. So that's incredibly alarming. But the really unfortunate thing is that you have businessmen like Dalio, investors like Dalio, who are echoing this lunacy. So indeed, obviously, it's rampant. Now, I grant you that. I only meant that I would expect a little bit more from Ray Dalio, or I expect a little bit more from the guy you mentioned, whose name escapes me, who's written a couple of books and you say is informative. If you say he has some understanding of Austrian economics, I would expect that he would understand the fairly simple lesson of the Japanese economy that we've learned, that planning doesn't work, or the lesson of the Soviet economy, or the lesson, indeed, of the Chinese economy, which moved very heavily in favor of capitalism by the late 1970s. But indeed, of course, it's a rampant fallacy. Absolutely.
Understood. All right. Well, like I mentioned, the Soho Forum is one of the coolest things on the internet right now. I've actually had some friends who've debated there, and I know that you have as well. I want to go ahead. My friend who... Well, first of all, I consider Dave Smith a friend of mine, though I don't know him personally. But the owner of the Scottish Libertarian podcast who debated or is going to debate on UBI, I'm a huge fan of his work.
A great guy. Yes. Yeah, no, He was supposed to, interestingly, there's a connection between him and Dave Smith. Ironically, Anthony Samaroff, a great guy, I was on his show once. He was going to debate Andrew Yang.
Right.
And Andrew Yang for president, who wants to bring about the UBI. We could talk about that a little bit, the UBI. Robotics, and Andrew Yang pulled out. We sold tickets. And because Andrew Yang was popular, we sold about half the house, and Andrew Yang pulled out at the last minute. So we had to get somebody else to debate Anthony, and that's scheduled in January, Anthony's debate. And with a technical guy. And we scheduled the debate that Dave Smith was going to have about the future of the Libertarian Party, and that took place in September, a very popular debate that he had with Nicholas Sarwark. And indeed, Dave is a terrific guy, and so is Anthony. And so, because I've been insulting a lot of people behind their backs, and I thank you for the opportunity for me to say something nice about somebody. There are a lot of people I have a high regard for. And,
understood.
And called me the godfather of the free market movement. I certainly like to think of myself as one of the elder statespeople, a huge contributor, but of course I bow to the role that so many others have played who are living still to this day, like Walter Block and Tom Woods, who you mentioned. Tom Punchin published the first really major book about the Great Recession called Meltdown. So Tom Woods' contributions have been greater than mine to the libertarian movement.
Yes, unbelievable. But Gene, still, you have more than played your role. And again, I really appreciate this conversation. We'll link to the Soho Forum in here. And is there anything else that you want us to link to besides that?
The Soho Forum, no, that's good enough. And as a matter of fact, I was on a Contra cruise, with that Tom Woods runs, and I made a couple of friends who were trying to start a Soho Forum West in Los Angeles. And so maybe that'll happen. But I'm sure that this podcast has enormous reach, and that every once in a while Los Angelinos like to visit New York City. My debate with Richard Wolff will be on November 5th in New York City at NYU. And so please come.
Perfect. All right, Gene. Thanks again.
Sure. Bye-bye.
All right, listeners, thanks for checking out the episode. As always, the contact information for our guest will be available in the show notes page, which is hosted on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. Don't forget, if you want access to some of the free goodies that I'm talking about at the beginning of these episodes, like free ebooks, weekly investor emails, and articles about some of the most important investment-related topics, make sure that you have created an account with CFC, because this stuff is automatically available. You can do this by going to cashflowconnections.com and signing up as an accredited investor. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at hunterthompson@cashflowconnections.com. Thanks again.